Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on what might be one of the strangest but also most relevant Good Fridays that we will ever experience together. Because while we are all quarantined, sealed inside our homes, as it were, at this time of loss and fear about what the future might hold, perhaps Jesus' journey to and death on the cross has more to say to us than ever. So, in this digital service, you will see each of the participants reading a part of Jesus' story from their own home. You might also notice varying degrees of quality in sound and video, and for that, we just ask your grace. Because as each person finishes reading, what they're going to do is blow out their candle and then leave the recording altogether, slowly letting our screen become increasingly dark and empty, as this way for us to experience the journey towards the cross and the tomb as it progresses. Why? Because to experience resurrection's glory, we have to be willing to face the loss and lament of the cross first, both for Jesus, but also in our own lives. This is the path of Christ. And so, welcome to Good Friday, and let us worship together. Welcome to Good Friday, the night we embrace both our loss and the cross of Christ.
Tonight, we walk the path of Christ.
In the garden, Jesus asked to avoid the pain.
Tonight, we walk the path of Christ.
Those meant to protect him betrayed him for wealth and power.
Tonight, we walk the path with Christ.
Those closest to him moved to keep their distance.
Tonight, we walk the path of Christ.
He humbled himself to save those he loved.
Tonight, we walk the path of Christ.
He suffered for the sins of a broken world.
Tonight we walk the path of Christ.
He spoke truth to power despite the cost.
Tonight we walk the path of Christ.
He sacrificed all on the cross for us.
But we can only go so far.
So may we remember the Christ who died, sharing in his death for the salvation of all.
He came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial."
While he was still speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man?" When those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, "Lord, should we strike with the sword?" Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this." And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who had come for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." Then they seized Jesus and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house.
Now Peter was following at a distance. When those who had seized Jesus had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him in the firelight, stared at him and said, "This man also was with him." But Peter denied it, crying, "Woman, I do not know him." A little later, someone else, on seeing him, said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then about an hour later, still another kept insisting, "Surely this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Now the men who were holding Jesus began to mock him and beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophecy, who is it that struck you?" They kept heaping many other insults on him.
When day came, the assembly of elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought Jesus to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." All of them asked, "Are you, then, the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Then the assembly rose as the body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no bias for the accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time.
When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then Herod put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies.
Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us!" This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts so that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over to be crucified as they wished.
It is now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my
Tonight we sit with the Savior that has been killed. We seal him inside, not knowing for how long or what can happen next. Tonight, we are invited to hold the hopes that seem lost. We face the fears and the tears of a broken world with sin in hand. Tonight, we begin the long, silent wait, the days when nothing was written or work was done. Can you relate? Tonight, we join Jesus in death for the story that is not done yet and the joy that still lays in the tomb.
I'm so happy, so